Okay, so hi everyone. Happy Global Encryption Day. My name is Laura and I'm here joined by my partner Dana to present you our work Communications Intercepted, Evaluating Government Interventions in Global Encryption Regimes. So as a very quick introduction, both me and Dana just finished our Masters in Public Administration in University College London. We're here today representing our department, the Departments of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy. And we're here to present our master's thesis, which was conducted in partnership with Internet Society. We're very, very thankful for Robin's help throughout the process. Robin was our connection to Internet Society, and although he cannot join today, he was a massive part of this project. So thank you very much, Robin. We're also here joined by our one of our interviewees, Ramy. He will be joining us maybe later and answering questions later. So the way we will structure the session is by presenting our work for the next 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a 15, 20 minutes conversation with Ramy. Feel free to ask him any questions. He's a very insightful person on this topic, an expert like me and Dana are not. So any questions, please leave them at the end and we'll be more than happy to answer them. So about the nature of the project itself, it is, as I said, an academic project. It is a master's thesis. It was a group-based research project conducted as a sort of consultancy research basis. The objective, as I said, is to evaluate government interventions into encrypted communications. We're not going to be talking about encryption as a tool and in a global sense, but more of as a service presented and available in specific applications of communication platforms. We mainly focused on apps such as WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, the most commonly used ones, where we are able to, as the sender, send messages to whoever is the intended recipient in a way that is private, that is secure, and that is not accessible in any way by any third parties. That includes service providers, that includes law enforcement, and that obviously includes states. So this is the focus of the project, end-to-end encrypted communications. And at its core, there's a very old debate known as the going dark debate, in which we obviously acknowledge the importance of having online spaces where we can have private, secure communications, and we're free to say and do as we please, but also the misuse and the criminal activities that those spaces can then maybe facilitate. So what has happened in the last few years is that we've seen maybe the rise of some misuse of encrypted platforms for organized crime, for the distribution of child sexual abuse material, for threats of national security. And so we've had law enforcement and governments claim that encrypted platforms are effectively putting evidence beyond the reach of legal scrutiny. That is, they're effectively going dark because evidence is no longer available to them, meaning that criminals are allowed to organize themselves and do criminal activities in a way that then can be led unpunished, basically. So this balance, this competing interests of having, on one hand, the ability to have private, secure spaces online, and then having also security concerns that come from having these spaces, is known as the going dark debate. It's been so overly discussed, and there's such extensive research on it. But yeah, in recent years, we've seen that there's been a lot of developments from multiple stakeholders, which bring a new light or a new breath of fresh air into what we know the going dark debate to be. On one hand, we've seen law enforcement more than ever claim the need for security with, as I said, rising threats of national security, growing numbers of child sexual abuse material being shared in encrypted platforms, organized crime as well rising in mainly Telegram and Signal. We've seen this push from law enforcement to gain access, to have an in, stop going dark, have some light, get some evidence. And when we look at the scale, that it's obviously the scale towards the security prioritization. But by doing that, we are also then compromising the fundamental rights. I just talked about the privacy, the right to privacy, the right for online private secure communications, which then on one hand we have law enforcement claiming that security needs to be the priority, and then fundamental rights are being breached. We have users who more than ever need spaces in which they can freely communicate without state surveillance, without corporate surveillance, without having their data being intercepted by any third party. We have a need for these rights, for fundamental rights such as the right to privacy, to be protected. So this is sort of the tensions that are rising. We've seen governments react to it. We've seen governments come out with new legislations regarding cybersecurity, encryption, crypto currency. We've seen new conversations being started, including chat controls that has not been yet legislated. It has not been yet put to practice, but that is a new conversation that's been longstanding and that has been on the minds of everyone who cares about this debate. And then we have obviously.
I'm so sorry. Your slides aren't changing.
Oh, okay, don't worry.
Yeah. If you can just like press present. Yeah.
Did it change now?
Honestly, they're not changing for me. It's kind of stuck on when you pressed present.
Oh.
Like on the Canva. Yeah.
You could have said that much earlier. Could you not have, Dana?
I was trying not to interrupt you.
Okay, let's figure this one out.
Okay. Oh, is it changing for you? Oh, someone said you might want to try doing autoplay.
Autoplay.
Yeah, autoplay.
Can you try and do it, Dana? Maybe that's the best way to go about it.
Sure, 1 second.
I don't think I can do it.
We'll try sharing it from my end. We are so sorry for the delay. Okay. Okay, it works from my end, so I'm just going to share my screen. One second.
Very funny to see that the technology experts are actually.
It's not working, yeah.
I don't know, it's
Okay.
experts at all.
Oh, it's gonna have to quit Zoom for some reason.
Okay, don't worry. I think I have a way to do this.
Okay. I mean, technically, if you just like press.
Let me click autoplay because someone said that that's the way to go.
Okay.
Can everyone see now?
Have you pressed present?
this is like my worst nightmare.
Oh, we could see it for a second there.
Yeah.
I did, Dana, mention if you can send me the link on my email on chat, you will see, and then I can try to do it for you. If I have the file, it's just that I don't have it.
Yeah, wait, I have a link for that.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
found- Does that work?
Michael, have you can you have access to the link? If I share it like this, does it work?
Can you just try going to like the slide after? Like yeah, that works.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's a way of yeah.
Can we continue on these terms? Is that okay? I'm so sorry.
Yes, that works. That's working. Thank you.
Okay. Guys, really sorry. Really bad start to the first conference ever. But once again, welcome. And this is our project, Communications Intercepted. As I said, master's thesis. It's me and Dana. It is very academic in nature, and the focus is end-to-end encryption and communication services at bases. The competing interests I was talking about, the fundamental rights of privacy, freedom of expression, data, all of these things that we know and love, versus security objectives, the very old going dark debate. I'm sure everyone who's attending this conference knows the going dark debate to extensive lengths. So that said, this is sort of the context in which this project is outsourced. We understand that there's a lot happening both in terms of government interventions, platforms' reactions, user sentiment, and then law enforcement objectives. When Robin and Internet Society reached out to understand what is happening in terms of this global encryption landscape, we quickly realized we needed to redefine our focus. So this is what we came up with. We tried to think of what we could do and what was feasible within the space of 6 months to analyze. And we decided that what we truly wanted to focus on was understanding why governments were now deciding to reevaluate longstanding legislations, what is driving that, both explicitly and implicitly. So what is being offered as a public statement as a rationale, but also like what are the social political factors which influence politics and policy, but are not always stated. And then the enforcement attitudes, like what is being used to actually enforce these objectives. And that includes how restrictive these policies are, how technical they are, if they're legal, what is the intent behind it, but also the tool. And this is the two-lens model we came up with. Our research questions were intended to be how the global government interventions into encrypted communications, how the global interventions to encrypted communications affect the balance that I was just talking about. What are the rationales that are commonly used by governments to justify exceptional access, and what types of government interventions are being offered newly. We're also going to talk a little bit about proportionality and how can it be applied to encryption debates, but that's a case for later. In terms of when we first started doing this analysis, the research gaps that we found, we understand this is a very extensive debate and that there's so much literature on it, and just that it has been around for too long for it to not be so exhaustively discussed. But we did find that a lot of the discussions happen on a national or sort of like EU Five Eyes level, but there's no real place which has a centralized source of information. So there's a lot of cross-jurisdictional studies, but not a global understanding or one place which has a global overview. We also found that the comparative work that does exist, it's either outdated because it is a very fast-paced, changing area, or lagging behind. Once again, no one's fault. It's just the nature of the subject. We also found that coverage tends to be a little bit biased towards the North America, European Union, Western countries. When we tried to look into Africa, especially, it was hard to find information. It's hard to know why, when we try to, for example, understand the rationales or the tools, there's not as much information available, which we understand why, but when you're trying to do a global overview, it is important to be as equitable as possible. And yeah, we also found that this tends to be a very technical debate that often leaves behind social political considerations such as regime types and freedom of expression in other forms, how privacy is understood not just in terms of encryption, but maybe beyond even technical and digital spaces. So when we started this project for Internet Society, there was a need for an attempt to maybe bridge these gaps. Not sure we did bridge them or fill them very well, but we did try. Yeah.
Okay, so our research actually produced two principal outputs. So the first is an original data set which mapped how governments regulate encryption access. And we looked at more than 200 territories. Again, these were territories that were standardized by the UN, so any sovereign authority was included. It wasn't just countries. And then the second was an assessment of proportionality frameworks, which analyzes how legal systems approach these questions of access, mandates, but also the protection of rights. And together, these deliverables kind of capture both the empirical realities of encryption regulation, but also the normative frameworks through which these interventions are often legitimized. So I'm going to start off with the first deliverable, and then we'll go back to Laura for the second. So just for context, our research doesn't exist in isolation. So when we first approached the subject, we really wanted to understand what was already out there, basically echoing what Laura just said. And a really good resource we found was actually Global Partners Digital, and they studied more than 100 countries to create what is before you on the screen, so the world map of encryption laws and policies. And basically their mapping assessed rights and obligations specific to encryption, and they also developed the scale ranging from minimal to widespread restrictions. So this scale really became a conceptual foundation for our project. It prompted us to really ask how these dynamics unfold, especially when considering all sovereign territories. So that question kind of inspired the creation of our original data set. What you see before you is just a sample that we wanted to show you of how some of the data set looked like, but we basically conducted a global analysis that covered more than 200 territories, and each territory was examined through statutory and legislative sources. And the goal here was to establish a foundation for comparative analysis, one that identifies the structural but also contextual patterns in the governance of encryption. And our work was, again, inspired by Global Partners Digital, but we really wanted to expand the scope. And so we actually developed variables, and then we've standardized categories for them. So we looked at things like explicit rationales, which are basically the explicit reasons government publicly provide when introducing or amending encryption laws. We looked at implicit rationales, which were actually drawn from secondary sources like NGO reports, and they were highlighting underlying motives. We then looked at restriction intensity, which is basically an expanded version of Global Partners Digital Scale. And then we also looked at typologies, which is classifying policy instruments used, and we also looked at enforcement, which is measuring the degree to which these policies are realized. So to ensure this analytical consistency across 200 territories, we created what you see before you, which is a standardized codebook. Again, this is just like a section for your reference. But basically, every category and variable used in our data set had a standardized definition. Now, this isn't a universal classification system. It was actually developments or definitions that we've developed specifically for our project on our research questions. And we specifically made them broad so that they could encompass more countries, because we were trying to fit 200 countries into about 6 to 7 categories. And again, so we looked at things like decryption assistance mandates, which require access without prescribing technical methods. We looked at licensing regimes in different countries. And we think it's really interesting to highlight the fact that decryption assistance mandates were actually the most commonly used regulatory typology. And certain literature would argue that it is a less restrictive option. However, that is not without its faults. And then we looked at kind of contextualizing what is out there. Oh, sorry, no, we looked at our contributions to the project. So the way we did that was that we really wanted, again, to expand the scale. And we found that the best way to go about that was actually to break down the moderate restrictions, because moderate seemed to be this umbrella term. And over 100 countries ended up being in that cluster. So we broke that down to further contextualize restriction intensities. And what we did was we created moderate discretionary, which is when governments basically don't have a very clear-cut bureaucratic trail or process for how encryption is regulated. Whereas moderate procedural is a more bureaucratic judicial approach, where you can actually track and see how governments even get permits to break encryption. And yeah, so then that was kind of the data side of our project. We then had these qualitative methodologies to complement that. So we started off with semi-structured interviews, which involved participants across 7 countries. And that was also then complemented by a legal, it was complemented by a legal literature review. But basically, across both the data set and the interviews, we found quite a few key findings that we want to share with you today. So the first one is that law enforcement sits at the forefront of encryption regulation. So crime prevention actually emerged as the most commonly stated objective across the 8 world regions we identified. However, immediately following this prominence was actually the widespread presence of undisclosed regulations. So more than 50 countries either lacked transparency or simply possessed no publicly available data on encryption laws. In some instances, especially in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, there were no policies that we were able to identify. And this opacity, again, stems from either institutional secrecy or just the absence of these formal legislations. And then when examining, again, the rationales, we observed that domestic concerns and political framing often intersect. So for instance, in Latin America, high domestic crime rates have enabled governments to justify more intrusive interventions because they appeal to public anxieties. Whereas in Europe, emotional narratives surrounding CSAM have actually kind of taken similar trend, with policymakers framing encryption regulation as a moral imperative. So these examples kind of illustrate how governments actually invoke this kind of emotive political dimension when introducing encryption policies. However, our project isn't undermining the real threats that are being presented by not tackling these crimes. And now, moving away from the actual rationales, we wanted to also study enforcement, where we found that there was a clear discrepancy between legislation and implementation. So decryption assistance mandates, again, were the most frequently prevalent typology, but their enforcement was typically weak. So even when statutory frameworks were established, governments rarely disclosed information on compliance or how they were able to follow up with the introduction of policies. And several interviewees talked about this overbearing of responsibilities. So they described a needle in a haystack phenomenon, where extensive indiscriminate data acquisition basically obstructed investigations because it became so much harder for law enforcement to find the needle in the haystack. And therefore, a number of experts actually recommended more targeted enforcement mechanism. So some introduced lawful hacking of specific devices or accounts. And while these proposals remain contentious, they were perceived as more proportionate than the mass data acquisition that we were faced with. And another and final current theme in terms of enforcement and feasibility was actually a technical knowledge gap among policymakers. So this disconnect often results in legislation that misinterprets how encryption actually works. So to counter this or to mitigate this in Egypt, there was this initiative that emerged, which was a postgraduate program that was designed to educate policymakers, legal professionals, advocates. It was pretty much an open program that was trying to bridge the gaps between the politics and kind of the conceptual parts of encryption regulation, but also the technical aspects of it. And finally, when trying to synthesize all these insights, a pattern of performative regulation emerges. So we see that certain interventions are introduced primarily for symbolic or political purposes. So in India, there was a traceability requirement under the 2021 Information Technology Act, and it was introduced following the death of a public figure. And it was framed as kind of a necessary step to combat misinformation. However, there's limited, again, information on how this was enforced or why. And in Brazil, similarly, a fake news bill was gaining traction after the aftermath of 2023, the attack on government buildings. But again, it just reflects how crises actually catalyze legislative momentum. And it just reminds us of the fact that, you know, encryption, when being regulated, becomes inherently political. So we then identified the weaponization of social causes. So we see this specifically in Sweden and the UK, where CSAM, or the prevention of CSAM, is positioned as a social cause. And in that sense, these debates are suddenly moral binaries. So the opposition or people that would advocate for protecting encryption suddenly become ethically suspect. And finally, ambiguities, again, is a defining feature of the global encryption landscape. So some ambiguities are intentional, because they act as, you know, strategic umbrellas. When things are broad, governments can actually have selective enforcement or can exercise targeted prosecution, whereas when they're unintentional, they can be as a result of limited technical capacities. And just again, to recap, encryption regulation is not technical. It is deeply political, and it embodies the ongoing negotiation between state power, civil liberties, but also technological autonomies. And once we've actually completed all this analysis, we realized that we've only examined one side of the question. So, you know, we looked at how states act, how interventions manifest, and how individuals experience these. But then we really wanted to consider the other side of the things. We wanted to look at how regulations were justified, contested, and constrained from a legal point of view. And that's what Laura will introduce.
So as Anna said, we came to this point where we have all of our findings, and we quickly understood that the balance that we're trying to explore between fundamental rights and security objectives was clearly unbalanced. It was not reaching the sweet points of harmony. So we tried to create a metric to maybe understand why it is unbalanced, why do we feel like every regulation out there is not succeeding in achieving its stated aims? And this is when we came across proportionality. Now, I know that our audience is mainly a technical one, but proportionality is just a legal principle written in the International Human Laws Convention that basically tries to understand what is the balance between a regulation's objectives versus its consequences. And it does so by questioning it in 4 dimensions. The first one is by assessing its legitimacy. That is the legitimacy of its goal. It then questions whether if the tool proposed by a regulation is suitable to achieve its stated aim. It then moves on. If it succeeds in being legitimate and suitable, it questions whether if it's necessary, that is the least intrusive way of achieving the stated goal. And then at the end, we do a proportionality assessment in a more strict sense. That is, we actually weight the benefits and the costs, and we see if something is proportional. So in order to be able to apply this to do this mental exercise with our findings, we conducted a systematic literature review and an REA. And we actually came across this paper by Farlow and Edwards, which is on my left, which breaks down proportionality into a test, but in relation to encryption regulations. And so taking inspiration from Farlow and Edwards and our findings and all the things we found in our literature review, we redefined their proportionality framework and proportionality as a principle, and we created our own framework to assess encrypted communications, or at least to see if how our findings reacted to this test and this principle. So we define legitimacy, as I said, as a lawful, evidence-based, linked to a communal good objective. We define suitability as the assessment of the technical design and feasibility of the tool being proposed to achieve the legitimate aim. And then we moved on to necessity as an evaluation of, is the tool being proposed the least intrusive in the way that it doesn't compromise the fundamental rights we keep talking about. The final balancing competing interests proportionality assessment is just an overview, a fourth stage where you get to once you pass stage 1, 2, and 3. And then we designed accountability and transparency mechanisms to be able to operationalize this framework in case it ever happens in real life. In case anyone ever wants to use it, we have ensured that it can be operationalized and is practical, and it can be done in a lawful and practical way. So when we go back to our findings, which was in a sense telling of how this, as I said, this balance is being maintained in today's landscape of encryption regimes, and we now look at it from the proportionality lenses, we now sit down to think, okay, let's think of legitimacy. We know that the most common explicit rationale being proposed by governments tends to be crime prevention, national security, and child protection. And at face value, all these three rationales are legitimate without contention. There is evidence that they are that there are rising levels of all three in global across all regions, and it is clear that they are linked. Solving them is linked to a bigger communal good. So we understand that at face value, legitimacy is something that is beyond and behind every regulation in place. However, when we then sit down and we think about the implicit rationale and the socio-political powers that you often play into politics and policy, and we see that perhaps these narratives are being pushed because they create a sense of urgency and a sense of there's an emotional reaction to these words, child safety, national security, and we know that these narratives push agendas and make policy happen, and we know that politics and policymakers understand this. We then begin to think that perhaps what we've seen is that there is a legitimacy facade being posed at the forefront of hidden agendas. There's always a concern of state surveillance when we're talking about encryption regulations, and that is something that it's very hard to pose and question when the forefront of the discussion is a very legitimate goal, such as child safety, national security. And so it's a very controversial issue, and we're obviously not questioning that there are very real issues that need to be solved, but because what we've seen through interviews, we understand that this is by nature a social and political debate. We need to question whether legitimacy is something that is evidenced or just being pushed as a narrative. So this is sort of the discussion we have with legitimacy. Suitability, once again, as we've seen, there is a feasibility gap between what is mandated and regulated and legislated versus what is put into practice, what is actually feasible and practical. And so that said, we went back to see to our data set, to our legislations, to the regulations we've observed, to the countries we explored through interviews, and we saw that a lot of the times the tools being proposed to be used, such as the decryption assistant mandates, they tend to be suitable in theory, but not in practice. So once again, in our discussion, we found out that a lot of regulations fail to meet the suitability threshold. In terms of necessity, we discovered that decryption assistant mandates are the most common regulation in practice. Well, in theory. But we also know that there are alternative methods such as metadata analysis, client-side scanning, device hacking, legal hacking, etc., that are much less intrusive. So for governments to put the narrative forward that it is necessary to instill a backdoor into vulnerable systems, it is necessary to have a decryption assistant mandate legislation in place when we know that there are less intrusive alternatives out there. In the terms of discussion and just for the sake of academic work, it makes you once again question whether if there is a necessity facade or if it is actually necessary to maybe do things this way. And putting it all together, I know this is very academic and a little bit conceptual, but putting it all together, I think what we found was that when you assess current legislations and current jurisdictions, conversations about encryption through the lenses of proportionality, we understand that at a certain point of the evaluation, legislations have failed because they do not meet the thresholds disclosed here to some extent. So whether if it's legitimacy, suitability, necessity, or just the fact that they did not manage to keep the balance between security and fundamental rights, there is always a disproportion between what is being mandated versus what is actually needed and what can actually, and solutions that can actually solve the encryption problem. So this is when our project recommendations come in. This is mainly targeted to policymakers, so feel free to ignore them if you're not a policymaker. But we do think that exercises such as the proportionality test and proportionality frameworks and these sorts of more conceptual discussions about a technical issue is something that needs to be incorporated into policy spaces. There needs to be a way to ensure that rights are respected in technical and cybersecurity debates in a way that's perhaps even legislatively doing so. Like we maybe need to make sure that that actually happens in a practical sense. That obviously is an exercise that needs to happen, but in a transparent and accountable way as well. So we want once again advocate for transparency and accountability to be something that's embedded into the policy design. And as Dana said, capacity building for policymakers and law enforcement so that there is an understanding that these debates are much broader than what they perhaps showcase to be. And multidisciplinary research for civil society, understanding that, once again, these things don't exist in a vacuum. Encryption regimes, political regimes, statecraft, history, context, all of these things matter and they need to be incorporated into our understanding of encryption landscapes. And yeah, jurisdictional learning and standardization, obviously, as a way to move forward in a more efficient way. Key takeaways. Non-surprisingly, encryption regulation continues to be a wicked policy problem. There is no right way to really find the balance and that sweet spot between these two competing interests in a standard way, as we know of so far, and as we know of from a non-expert perspective. There perhaps is a need for further research, both on these topics and much more on others. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone's presentation today to maybe see if we can find new solutions and new ways of thinking. So thank you so much for bearing with. And I know we have 15 minutes left, which we would love for Ramy, if Ramy is here.
So unfortunately, Ramy has not been able to access the call today. We've been trying for about an hour now.
Okay, it's okay. Well, we had a very, very interesting guest from Egypt tell us about his story as someone who lives in a regime which has a license to operate. So in Egypt, you need a license to have encrypted, to have access to encrypted communications as a user. And Ramy was going to share his very, very interesting experience living in such a regime, but sadly, today is not our day. Nothing seems to be really working our way. However, we would love to have any questions about anything. We know we said a lot of information. We took some stabs at governments and regulations and very important people. So any comments, any questions, please feel free to ask.
Laura, we have 2 questions on the Q&A. I don't know if you can see
Okay.
it. At the bottom of your screen, there is an icon that says Q&A, and there's 2 questions in there. One from Yves Laurent and another one from Ellie.
Okay, maybe now is the time I stop sharing my screen. Okay. Q&A. What is legal hacking and how do you characterize it? Do you want to have a
Sure.
go at it, Anna?
Yeah, so basically our understanding of legal hacking came from a stakeholder in Brazil. And he specifically kind of introduced this notion to us by suggesting that basically if a government were to target a specific suspicious individual or someone that they believe is a suspect, what the government can do is use, again, so hackers, technologists, but basically the ethical or the legal side of it would be that no harm is done to people beyond so if the suspect is, let's say, surveyed, the suspect's family wouldn't be. So no one would basically pay the cost of one person being monitored. And again, we know that this concept in itself is kind of an ethical issue and concern. So we know that the idea in itself is a debate. We just wanted to kind of echo what different stakeholders have been telling us. Again, we've interviewed people from 7 countries, so we really wanted to show you guys the different contexts. But yeah, so he also talked about legal hacking, but also metadata. So he was talking about how the government was able to use cell phone tower data,
Oh yes, in
basically
the
locate the suspect and actually arrest the murderer. There was a murder committed, and through basically tracking the person's phone and through cell phone tower data, they were actually able to find the suspect, which we think is a very successful kind of story because it required no breaking of encryption. It was just publicly available metadata. Do you want to take the second one?
Yeah. So the second question is, did you identify any specific avenues for further research? I think the main one, as I said, and as we keep reiterating, is keeping in mind that although this is obviously a technical debate and a cybersecurity one, there are a lot of social political factors that go into it and that shape it in a way. So at a very early on stage, we try to find a correlation between democracy indexes and intensity of restriction of encryption regimes. We actually used the data set from Global Partners Digital, and we matched it with Freedom House, if anyone knows about these 2 data sets. And I try to see, for example, if countries which are deemed by specific indexes to be less democratic had more propensity to be more restrictive on encryption regulations, to see if, for example, the way a government understands privacy and a citizen's right to privacy, if it understands it in a specific way, in a specific context, if that could be translated into the encryption debate, and if we could actually take that and bring some new light and new life into the encryption debate. So I think similarly to this and in line with this, more research that tries to understand the going dark debate and the encryption debate through new avenues. I think it has the technical part itself, we all understand it, and it has been extensively researched. We need to maybe look at it from a different perspective. So maybe we're obviously social science students, so we're biased, but maybe just new avenues. I'm not sure if there's one specific one, but yeah.
If I can just add to that, just as someone that kind of was really involved in the data part of the project, I think that something we really highlighted as a really big gap was actually, obviously there's a lack of data. We understand that. We're not surprised at that. But we really wanted the existing data to be more contextualized, which is kind of why we created our own data set, because we felt like VDEM addressed, over 60 variants of democracy. Global Partners Digital looked at the legal side of things. We found freedom on the internet. That was another index we've looked at. We've looked at, I think, BTI as well. We had a lot of indices involved. But what we really wanted was a comprehensive, contextualized data set, because you can study a country's institutional context, you can study kind of internet security purely through numbers. But again, because it's not purely technical nor purely political, it would be really, really valuable to have more, and again, more credible sources that bridge that gap. So I think that's also a gap that we would have loved to kind of see filled.
From Jack Tracy, I know we have just a couple more minutes to answer, but he asked, how did you react to the political developments that took place during your research, such as the UK versus Apple and EU chat control? So as I said, when we first started the project, we actually came to Robin and we said, we're very excited to report live on any new developments as we go along and as we do the project. And Robin looked at me and said, that's nearly impossible. If you fixate on any new development, you will be talking to me every day, and I do not want that. So when you're asking, how did you react? We obviously took a lot of it. We tried to talk to a lot of stakeholders which were involved in these new developments. We talked to someone in the UK who was part of the civil society aspect of the UK versus Apple debate, someone who had been going to court, someone who knew more or less what was happening with the situation. And same with the EU, we didn't go through with this, with the talking to the French Minister of the Interior. We were going to talk to him, but we actually couldn't find a slot. But we did talk to someone who was an ex-member of the EU Parliament, and we tried to address this new recent development. So if you're asking how did we react, we tried as much as we could to dig into them and get to new insights. What we found was that although it would be great to have the opportunity to tell you something new about these things that we all care about, well, at least I personally found that the views we had from our interviewees tended to be sort of biased, because there is a recency to the issue. And so I think it polarizes people a little bit. We found that, for example, in the EU chat controls issue, some stakeholders were not as rational and as maybe straightforward as they could. And I think there's still a lot of space for a little bit of ambiguity and not as much of an academic standard as we'd hope. So yeah, that's why we didn't go into that much of new developments. We just didn't think there was information that was, I don't know, as academic as we like yet. Do you want to add anything then?
Honestly, I think most of the recent developments that happened, including like the Online Safety Act, we've synthesized them into the political narrative side of the project. So when we looked at findings on, basically there was a specific politician, there was a quote even of, saying if you use VPN in the UK following the new act, then you're basically for CSAM or the distribution of CSAM. And I think that really fed into our political narrative side of the project, where we didn't necessarily look at the impacts just yet because it was really recent, as Laura said, but we kind of looked at the symbolism behind it and how these policies are kind of rolled out. So yeah, it was more like procedural than actual, like, this is our opinion on a certain policy. Oh, sorry, there's one more question about, do we intend to publish the data? I mean, we haven't actually considered publishing the actual data set, but if you're interested, we can definitely share that with you. Well, thank you. You're being very kind in the chat section. And if I can quickly shout out, someone from Global Partners Digital actually attended this talk. And that makes me really, really happy because we love your work. So thank you.
We do apologize for any inconvenience. I think this is why they don't allow students to come and present at very serious places. But we appreciate the support and the patience.
Thank you, Lara and Dana, for the presentation. I think that everyone loved it based on the chat. As you can see, great research, great content. Thank you for sharing this with us. Sorry for technical issues, but I think we've done a great job in the end. So thank you so much for joining the Global Encryption Day Summit. And for everyone that's in the room, our next session starts in about 7 minutes. So we're going to stop this session right now, and then you go back to the lobby and you join the next session that will be hosted by the Internet Society. So we hope to see you all there. And thank you again, Dana and Laura, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a
you.
pleasure.